Hi, everyone. My name's Alex Evans, and this is the first of 4 talks about the everlasting covenant. As we're going to explore, the everlasting covenant is an idea that's right at the heart of the Bible. It runs like a golden thread all the way from the book of Genesis through to the book of Revelation. And it's absolutely central to making sense of what's going on, of the kind of big story arc of the Bible as a whole. But we're also going to explore in these talks why this 3,000-year-old idea is incredibly relevant to our own times right now as we confront things like a climate emergency or hyper inequality or growing conflict all over the world. In today's talk, we're going to get into what the everlasting covenant is, how it was formed, what it means. But also, on a more personal note, I want to say a bit about why I love this idea so much, why, in fact, it was central to bringing me back to Christianity after I'd lost touch with it in my 20s. In the second talk, we're going to talk about what happens when that covenant gets broken, the ways in which we can break it, and how, when that happens, all of creation is at risk of unraveling as a result of that broken covenant. In the third talk, we'll get into how you mend a broken covenant, looking especially at the idea of atonement, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and how the ritual of atonement brings about restoration and mends the kind of damage that's been done to creation. And finally, in the fourth talk, we're going to get into what this means for us in our own times, and especially the idea that restoration is really about mending broken relationships, our relationships with ourselves, with each other, with creation, and ultimately with God. But I'm going to start today with my favorite film when I was a kid, Raiders of the Lost Ark. My brother and I watched this movie so many times that we literally wore out our VHS copy. We absolutely adored the story of this maverick archaeologist and his quest to find the lost Ark of the Covenant. And you can imagine how excited I was, therefore, when I met the real life Indiana Jones and actually became friends with her. Now, this is Margaret Barker. Margaret lives in a village just outside Derby. She's a lay preacher at her Methodist church. She talks with great affection about the ducks that she used to keep, and even more so about her grandchildren. But none of this should deceive you about how formidable Margaret is as a theologian. Margaret is fluent in both Hebrew and ancient Greek. She used to be the president of the Society for Old Testament Studies, and she's one of the foremost experts in the world on the first temple, the temple that King Solomon constructed in around 950 BCE, and that was destroyed by the Babylonians just before the Jewish exile in about 586. And in particular, Margaret's an expert not just on the building of the temple, but the worldview that underpinned it, that was central to the people who worshipped there. Now, as you discover if you meet Margaret's work, a lot of that original worldview was lost, not actually in the Babylonian destruction of the temple, but in something that happened just before it, which was referred to in the Bible as King Josiah's reforms. Now, what was going on here was a bit like a cultural revolution, a massive purge, where lots of things that had been central to the theology of the first temple were got rid of just before that exile. And as Margaret explores in her work, there were many people who tried to keep the flame alive of that original temple worldview. But we have to be able to do some theological detective work to uncover that original worldview. And that's something that was central to what the first Christians were all about. And in our own times, it's become more and more possible to reconstruct that worldview because of recent archaeological finds. Things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were only discovered about 75 years ago. Or the Book of Enoch, a book that's always been part of the Bible in Ethiopia, where I used to live, but was lost to us here in the Western world until just a couple of hundred years ago. So let's start with that idea of the everlasting covenant. Now, as you know from reading the Bible, God goes through the Old Testament forming covenants with his people every few pages, basically. There's one with Noah, a little bit later there's a covenant with Moses, a bit further on there's another one with David, and so on. But the everlasting covenant is earlier than any of these. The everlasting covenant is the one that is formed at the moment of creation, which is why it's also sometimes called the creation covenant. And we can see it being formed in the very first chapter of Genesis. You'll know these words: the earth was without form and void, darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. This is the moment when it all began, when the kind of timeless, eternal moment before the Big Bang, if you like, before God said, "Let there be light." This is the point called day one, where all of creation exists in potential and it's about to burst forth into reality. And this is the moment where the everlasting covenant gets formed. Now, if you look at the book of Enoch, that book that I mentioned has always been central in the Ethiopian Bible, one of the things that's happening at the time that the great covenant gets formed is that God is swearing an oath that holds creation together. This oath puts the stars in their proper place and all of the planets. It keeps the seasons in their right cycle. It keeps the sea in its proper place. It's like a kind of invisible force that binds all of creation together. And if that sounds familiar, well, I'm not surprised, because if you take the idea of the Force in Star Wars, it owes a lot to the idea of the creation covenant. It's this idea of invisible bonds that hold everything together in its proper place and keep creation kind of in balance and in harmony. So that's the first thing that I love about the everlasting covenant. It's this very, very mystical vision, but that also says why creation is holy. It's not just interested in salvation in the afterlife. It's talking about how this life, where we are right now, all of this is holy as well, and part of that mystical creation. Now, the second thing that I really love about this vision of the everlasting covenant is that God's feminine aspect is very much to the fore here. If we look again at that line in Genesis 1, and that bit particularly where the Spirit of God is moving on the face of the waters, or you can also translate this as fluttering or hovering. It's an incredibly beautiful image. In the original Hebrew, that takes the feminine form. This is the female aspect of God, wisdom, as she's often called, who is present at the creation, and not just present, but actually in some ways giving birth to it. Again, it's a very mystical vision, but with a really feminine aspect at its core. And as we proceed through the book of Genesis, we find it as well in the Garden of Eden. Now, you'll remember, of course, that there's two trees that are really important in the Garden of Eden. One is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which we'll come on to next time, which is the tree that Adam and Eve are not supposed to eat from. But the one that they are supposed to eat from is the tree of life, which we read is right there in the center of the garden. And we know that the tree of life also represents wisdom because, for example, the book of Proverbs tells us so. Wisdom is a tree of life to those who take hold of her. Those who hold her fast will be blessed. So here's wisdom right at the center of the Garden of Eden and central to what Adam and Eve are supposed to be doing. They're supposed to be eating the fruits of wisdom's tree. And fascinatingly, I love this bit. The whole story arc of the Bible leads from that beginning in the Garden of Eden all the way to the last chapter of the book of Revelation. And there's that tree of life again. There's wisdom returning. On each side of the river stood the tree of life. The leaves of the tree are for the healing of nations. So in some ways, the Bible as a whole is a story of how wisdom was there at the very beginning. Wisdom was the tree that we were supposed to eat from. We lost access to that tree. And the story of the Bible as a whole is about how we eventually find our way back, and the tree of life, and therefore wisdom, returns. Again, it's a very beautiful kind of mystical vision. And then the third thing that I really love about the everlasting covenant is what it has to say about where we fit into the picture, about our place as humans in creation. Now, one of the lines in Margaret's writing that's never left me is the idea that in temple theology, resurrection was not a post-mortem experience. And what she's talking about here is what happened in Eden when Adam and Eve ate of the tree that they were supposed to eat from, when they ate the fruit of wisdom. And what's described there is that they're essentially reborn as a result of having access to wisdom, of partaking in wisdom. They begin to see reality as it truly is, free from any illusions. That's what wisdom is. And in the Orthodox Church in particular, this is described as a process of theosis, of becoming divine, of becoming, in fact, angelic. And this is, if you like, our birthright. This is what we are supposed to be as humans. We are invited into this kind of resurrection that is not a post-mortem experience through partaking of wisdom. And I also want to single out that really interesting line in Genesis 2:15 about how Adam and Eve's job was to till and keep the Garden of Eden. Nowadays, this is often interpreted as pointing towards kind of stewardship of the environment, and it does imply that, but it's also something much more sophisticated and profound. In Margaret's work, if you look at the original Hebrew, the kind of wordplay that's going on with those two words, tilling and keeping, is all about upholding right teaching and protecting the covenant. In other words, what's happening here is Adam and Eve have a priestly role in the Garden of Eden. They are kind of high priests of creation. And what that priestly role is all about is protecting the covenant and therefore protecting creation. So it's this beautiful image of what we're for as humans, of this divinely ordained purpose, and how we are invited into kind of that process of resurrection and becoming angelic, and thereby being able to kind of uphold the covenant and protect all of creation. Now, if you look at the layout of King Solomon's temple, it was a kind of physical representation of this set of ideas. Over on the top left here, you've got the Holy of Holies, the most sacred part of the temple. And that represented day one, the time before creation began, the sort of timeless eternity. And the high priest would only be allowed into the Holy of Holies once a year on the Day of Atonement, which, as we're going to come on to, is a really significant fact. Then you've got the veil, which is the kind of membrane, if you like, between the invisible aspect of creation and the visible creation that we see around us. And then in the rest of the temple, you have various things that represent the Garden of Eden. So, for example, the lampstand is a representation of the tree of life, and it's holy to the kind of lady, to wisdom. So what we have here in the everlasting covenant is, as Margaret puts it, a vision of the unity of all things and how the visible, material world relates to another dimension of existence that unites all things into one divinely ordained system. It's this absolutely gorgeous tapestry that was formed at the very beginning of time and that we are not only part of, but charged with protecting. And in the next talk, we're going to get into what happens when we fail in that task and the covenant gets broken.